On a gray morning in Kodiak, Alaska, a state water tester crouches at the edge of the harbor, filling 2 glass vials from 2 different sources. He labels neither vial with a name, just 2 code numbers, written in grease pencil on strips of white tape. One vial came from the Cannery's discharge pipe, dumping fish waste into the harbor for as long as anyone in town can remember. The other came from a row of sealed wooden barrels behind a smokehouse a half-mile down the shore, barrels that belonged to a woman named Nadia Ivanov. Nadia is 34, a Latik, and the last of her family still working the fish camp her grandmother built by hand. She watches the tester from a distance, arms crossed, saying nothing. She already knows what's in her barrels. What she doesn't know yet is what the state will say about it. Further down the pier, Cannery owner Gil Torvald watches too, a cigarette between 2 fingers, unbothered. For 30 years, Torvald Packing Company has dumped its fish heads, guts, and frames straight into the harbor. This summer, the state gave him a deadline to stop. The test today will measure nitrogen levels and bacteria counts in both samples. 1 number for waste left raw in open water, 1 number for whatever is happening inside Nadia's sealed barrels. Inside one barrel that night, something is moving. Bubbles rise slow through a dark liquid, and a faint, sour, almost bready smell escapes when the lid is lifted. Nobody in town believes barrels behind a smokehouse could ever replace a cannery, but nobody in town has seen what the state's own numbers are about to show. At the picnic table behind the smokehouse, state biologist Carol Yates lays out 2 clipboards, one for the cannery's outflow pipe, one for Nadia's barrels. The cannery's discharge sample reads over 9,000 fecal coliform per 100 milliliters, ammonia nitrogen high enough to choke eelgrass. Nadia's barrels come back near 0 coliform, nitrogen locked into a stable, plant-usable form. Carol says it plainly. The barrels behind the smokehouse are cleaner water than anything that has come out of that cannery pipe in 30 years. Nadia doesn't smile. She thinks of the barrels bubbling and of a name she has heard her whole life but never fully understood, her grandmother, Vera. This is not the first time this harbor has kept a number like that quiet. 30 years earlier, a much smaller barrel sat behind a much smaller smokehouse. Kodiak Island, 1962. Vera Ivanov was 26, running the family fish camp alone after her husband was lost to a spring storm, and the guts from her own smokehouse were piling faster than the gulls could clear them. She remembered an older method, one her own mother used for preserving fish eggs in sealed containers underground. Keep the air out, and rot turns into something else entirely. Her first batch, left loosely covered, turned putrid within 4 days. The smell drove her dogs off the property and drew flies for half a mile. She had let air in. Without a tight seal, the wrong bacteria took over, and nitrogen just burned off into the air, as ammonia, instead of staying in the liquid. On the second try, she packed the barrel full to the rim, weighted the lid with a stone, and sealed the edge with tallow to keep the air out completely. This time, more brown sugar than before, enough to feed the right bacteria fast, so they could outrace the ones that cause rot before the oxygen inside ever ran out. 3 weeks later, she lifted the lid to a smell that surprised her. Sour, almost like fermented cabbage, not rot at all. The liquid underneath had gone the color of strong tea. Down the shore, the cannery's young owner, Warren Hale, had noticed something odd. Fewer gulls circling behind Vera's smokehouse than behind his own loading dock. One evening he walked over uninvited, took a jar of her liquid without asking, and carried it back to the cannery's small testing room, the one built for checking fish oil quality before shipment. His own lab numbers stunned him. Nitrogen content nearly triple what raw dumped waste carried, and none of the bacteria that made the harbor unsafe to swim in each August. He wrote the results down in the cannery's logbook. Then he closed it, put it in a drawer, and told no one. Not his foreman, not the town, not Vera. A cannery built on modern machinery wasn't going to credit an Alutiiq woman's barrel behind a smokehouse. Not in 1962. Not to him. Vera kept going anyway. She poured her finished liquid, cut with water, onto her own potato rows, And by August, the plants there stood taller and greener than any others in the village. The neighbors still called it witch water and kept their children from the barrels, even as they quietly asked her for a jar when their own cabbages came in small. She never sold it. She traded it, a jar for a bucket of halibut, a jar for mending nets, and taught her granddaughter, years later, to judge it ready by smell alone, sour and bready, never sharp. Back in the present, Nadia sets down her coffee and looks toward the old plank shed behind the smokehouse, the one full of her grandmother's boxes she has never fully gone through. If Warren Hale wrote those numbers down in 1962, the logbook that held them might still exist somewhere on this shoreline, and something in that shed is the only place left to look. Nadia crosses the yard behind the smokehouse and pulls open the shed door her grandmother locked years ago, hinges groaning against salt rust. Inside, dust hangs in the light from a cracked window, drying rack poles, cracked mason jars, a coil of tarred net nobody has touched in 30 years. Under a mildewed canvas tarp in the corner, she finds a wool blanket wrapped tight around something rectangular and heavy. She unwraps it slowly, a cloth-bound ledger, its cover stained dark where water once soaked through, the pages swollen and soft at the edges. The first pages are her grandmother Marfa's handwriting, trades logged in pencil, a jar of fermented fish liquid for a bucket of halibut, a jar for mended net. Near the back cover, folded twice and tucked flat against the binding, she finds 2 typed pages on letterhead she does not recognize. The Kodiak Agricultural Extension Office, dated March of 1962. The report compares 2 samples, raw cannery scrap and a fermented liquid submitted for testing. The fermented sample held nearly 3 times the stable nitrogen, at a pH low enough that its bacteria count read almost clean. At the bottom of the second page, in ink instead of type, 7 words are scrawled and signed, not for the cannery's name, W. Hale. 30 years earlier, in the cannery's front office, a young Warren Hale had read those same numbers for the first time, the extension agent waiting across the desk for a reaction. The agent explained it plainly. The fermented liquid stayed stable, didn't reek of ammonia in the heat, and tested lower for bacteria than anything coming off the cannery's own dock. Hale asked where the sample had come from. The agent told him, the Ivanov fish camp, just past the point, where an Alutiiq woman had been fermenting scrap in barrels for as long as anyone could remember. He didn't argue, he folded the report, thanked the agent, and said nothing more about it that day. A week later, he walked the report and the empty sample jars out to the Ivanov smokehouse himself and left them on the step with the note already written. Marfa read it once, didn't say a word to anyone, and slid it into the back of her ledger, where it would sit untouched for 30 years. Back in the present, Nadia sits down hard on an overturned bucket, the report still open in her hands, and understands exactly what her grandmother had chosen to carry alone. Outside, past the smokehouse roof, the cannery stacks are still running, same as they had every summer of Nadia's life, waste pipes still running out under the dock into the harbor. That same week, a state skiff idles offshore from the cannery's outfall, a technician lowering a sample bottle into water that has run cloudy and rust-colored every August for as long as anyone can remember. On the dock, men who've worked the cannery line for 20 years talk in low voices about a shutdown deadline nobody wants to say out loud, the only steady paycheck this town has. At the county recorder's office in Kodiak, Nadia signs the last page of her grandmother's estate papers, and the fish camp, smokehouse, drying racks, shed and all, becomes hers by law. That evening she stands at the end of the dock with the ledger under her arm, looking across the water at the lit windows of the cannery office where Warren Hale still keeps his desk. Nadia climbs the cannery office stairs before her nerve fails her, the water-stained logbook page folded once inside her coat. She sets the page flat on Warren Hale's desk, next to his coffee cup, and does not say a word. Warren looks down, and his own handwriting from 30 years ago looks back up at him, his initials, his numbers, dated and signed. He doesn't deny it, he just goes quiet, the way a man goes quiet when there's nothing left to argue. The page showed what he'd tested back in 1961. Fermented fish scrap, outperforming raw dump runoff, Nitrogen held stable instead of washing straight into the harbor. 30 years earlier, a younger Warren Hale had read the same numbers in this same office and decided nobody needed to see them. He'd folded the report once, slid it into the bottom drawer, and turned the little brass key. An Eluditique woman's fermenting method had outperformed his own dump site, and crediting that, back then, wasn't a thing he was willing to do. Now, decades later, the state agency's letter sat on the same desk, stamped with a deadline: 90 days to stop discharging waste into the harbor, or the cannery's permit would be pulled. On the dock the next morning, cannery workers passed the news mouth to mouth, the way bad weather gets passed before it arrives. 90 days wasn't long enough to fix a discharge system built in another decade. Everyone on that dock understood what a shutdown would mean for their paychecks. Nadia understood something else. If the cannery went dark, her fish camp went dark with it. No mill run, no ice, no dock space to land a boat. She couldn't fix the cannery's pipes, but she could stop letting fish waste rot in the open behind her own smokehouse, and maybe prove there was another way to handle it. She hauled reject fish, heads, guts, frames the cannery wouldn't process, back to the camp in 5-gallon buckets, and started layering them into a food-grade barrel with brown sugar, the way her grandmother's notes described. The sugar wasn't for taste. It fed the lactic acid bacteria already living on the fish skin, and that bacteria, working without air, would lower the pH fast enough to stop rot before it started. Her first barrel went wrong within a week. She'd left the lid loose for airflow, out of habit from drying fish, and the smell that came off it told her everything. Air had let the wrong bacteria in. She dumped the batch on the compost pile behind the drying racks and wrote the mistake down in a notebook, the same way her grandmother once kept the cannery's log. Second barrel, she sealed the lid tight with a rubber gasket and left only a thin airlock hose running into a jar of water, a way to let gas escape without letting air back in. Warren Hale drove past the fish camp on his way to the dock and slowed his truck long enough to see the barrels lined up behind the smokehouse. He didn't stop. He just called out through the window that it looked like something an old lady does with her garden, not a business. Word of it made its way around town by supper time, the way most things did, a story that got a little more mocking with every telling. Nadia kept checking her airlock jar every morning anyway, counting the bubbles, because bubbling meant the fermentation was working, even if nobody in town believed it yet. But bubbling in a jar wasn't a business, and the cannery's 90 days were already counting down. She had no way yet to prove what was inside those barrels was any safer than what Warren had been dumping for years. By the second week of August, Nadia stopped waiting for the town to believe her and drove into Kodiak to see Roy Sandin, the agent at the Cooperative Extension Office, the only man on the island with a pH meter and a mailing address at the state's Agricultural Experiment Station. Roy listened without laughing, which surprised her, and told her plainly what a lab could actually measure: nitrogen content, pH, and a coliform count. Proof, not opinion. She filled 3 glass sample bottles from the barrels behind the smokehouse, labeling each with the date and the week the batch had been fermenting. Then, for comparison, she waded down to the cannery's outfall pipe at low tide and filled a 4th bottle from the water, still running gray beneath it. The bottles went out on the next mail plane to the State Agricultural Experiment Station in Palmer, 400 miles north, the same lab that tested soil for farmers across the territory since before statehood. 3 weeks passed. The airlock jar on her windowsill kept bubbling, slower now, steadier, while the calendar nailed above her workbench counted down what was left of the cannery's 90 days. When the envelope finally came, the numbers answered the question she'd been carrying all summer. Her fermented liquid held a pH near 4, a stable nitrogen content close to what store-bought fish fertilizer claimed on its label, and no detectable coliform bacteria, while the cannery's own outfall sample showed ammonia levels 15 times the state limit, and coliform counts too high for the lab to even count by hand. For the first time since she'd sealed the first barrel, Nadia had something the town couldn't argue with on a dock or over coffee: a document. What she didn't have yet was a single buyer, and the 90 days were already down to 50-some. 30-some years earlier, in 1958, a younger Evdokia Ivanov had carried a jar of her own fermented fish liquid into the Cannery office to show Frank Halverson, who ran the plant before his son Warren ever did. Frank turned the jar over once in his hand, wrinkled his nose at the smell, and told her it was something an old woman did in her garden shed, not something a cannery needed to bother with. She walked home along the shoreline that evening, with the jar still in her coat pocket, past drying racks strung with salmon, the tide going out slow and gray behind her. That night, by lamplight, she wrote down what she'd measured with nothing but her own eyes and nose, the smell, the color, how many weeks each batch had sat, in a notebook nobody at the cannery had asked to see. She wrapped the notebook in oilcloth, laid it in a tin box, and set the box on a shelf in the tool shed behind the smokehouse. Not thrown away, just put away. She never brought it up at the cannery again. Whatever she'd proven to herself, she kept it, and she went back to drying fish the way her own mother had taught her, without ever knowing anyone would test it and get the same answer. Sitting at that same kitchen table decades later, Nadia thought about how her grandmother had never gotten a lab report like the one now in front of her, only a jar somebody sniffed at and handed back. With the numbers in hand, she drove out to the small greenhouse operation past the county road, run by a grower named Delia Kwan, hoping proof might do what talk never had. But down at the harbor store, the talk hadn't changed much. A report from Palmer was just paper to men who'd known Nadia since she was hauling salmon off her grandmother's skiff. When she brought a copy to Warren directly, he barely glanced at it. "Numbers on a page don't run a cannery," he said, and turned back to the crew loading crates onto the dock. 50 days left. Nadia went back to her barrels and kept working, because a report from a lab in Palmer wasn't a sale, and a sale was the only thing that would actually save the fish camp. Looking for more barrels to fill, she went digging through her grandmother's old tool shed, a place she hadn't properly cleared out since the funeral. Pushing aside a coil of rope, she found the same tin box her grandmother had shelved decades before, its lid rusted at the hinge, and inside it, tucked against the oilcloth-wrapped notebook, a second sheet of paper she didn't recognize. She pulled the page out far enough to see it wasn't her grandmother's handwriting at all, and she had no idea yet whose it was, or why it had been hidden in this box instead of a cannery file. Nadia carried the page to the shed's one window and tilted it toward the gray daylight, reading past the first line before her hands went still. The handwriting wasn't Evdokia's careful Cyrillic slanted script. It was cramped, technical, the kind a man writes fast when he doesn't expect anyone else to read it. At the bottom, a signature and a date, Franklin Dolan, October 1958, the founder of the cannery next door, dead now 11 years. Above the signature was a stamp, Territorial Fisheries Testing Station, Women's Bay. Franklin had sent samples of fermented fish waste there for analysis, back when Alaska was still a territory, not yet a state. The numbers matched what Nadia had been guessing at with pH strips all summer. His fermented barrels tested lower in bacteria and higher in usable nitrogen than the raw guts dumped straight off the cannery dock. Franklin Dolan had proven it 35 years before she ever filled her first barrel. And then, in a different pen, someone had scrawled 4 words across the bottom: "Do not file this." "No credit given," the note went on. Nadia understood then why it had never sat in a cannery file cabinet. It had been hidden in her grandmother's tin box instead, kept safe by the woman who'd taught him the method and gotten nothing for it. Warren Dolan, who ran the cannery now, was Franklin's son. He would have been a boy of 10 the year this report was buried. Too young to know, old enough now to have inherited the silence along with the business. The state's hearing on the cannery's discharge permit was set for Friday, 4 days away. A page in a shed meant nothing until someone official agreed it was real. She drove into town the next morning with the page sealed in a plastic sleeve, past boats still riding low with the last of the season's catch, to the county recorder's office above the harbor. A clerk named Peter Standifer pulled the cannery's original 1958 operating permit from a drawer of yellowed files and laid Franklin Dolan's signature beside the one on Nadia's page. The loops on the F, the flat cross of the T, they matched. Standifer said he'd stake his own name on it being the same hand. But a match wasn't evidence. The hearing officer would want a sworn statement, a chain of custody, something more than a woman saying she found it in her grandmother's shed. Word reached Warren Dolan by that afternoon. In a town of 400 people, nothing stayed quiet for long. He found Nadia at the harbor and asked, flatly, what she thought a scrap of paper was going to prove. She told him his own father had run the test. He went quiet for a long moment, jaw working, before he said his father was dead and couldn't answer for it, and walked back toward the cannery without looking back. That night, working by lantern behind the smokehouse, she pulled fresh nitrogen readings from her own barrels, proof from 1993, to stand beside proof from 1958. She mailed both, the old report and her own summer of numbers, to the State Environmental Office in Anchorage, along with a request that they be entered into the hearing record before Friday. An old cannery hand named Pyotr Chukwa stopped her outside the general store and said he remembered barrels like hers being tried once before, years back, though he couldn't recall who'd worked them. Nadia went back to the report that evening and found it, a second name, smaller, penciled beside Franklin Dolan's, almost erased by 35 years of handling. A technician's name, someone who had actually stood at those barrels and taken the readings by hand. She had no way yet of knowing if he was still alive, or if he'd remember any of it before Friday. The name in the ledger read, Simeon Kompkov, technician. Nadia asked at the harbor office, then the general store, then finally the tribal council desk, until someone said he still lived out past Women's Bay. She drove the coast road for 40 minutes, past drying racks bleached silver by salt wind, to a one-room cabin with a stovepipe leaning sideways and a skiff hauled up on blocks. An old man answered the door in a wool sweater, suspicious of the truck, before he recognized the surname Ivanov, and let her in without a word. Simeon Kompkov had run water samples for Franklin Dolan back in 1958, before he ever worked the cannery line himself, when he was 22 and paid $2 a day to keep the readings quiet. He remembered the barrels smelling sour instead of rotten, and a woman named Vera Ivanov standing over them with a wooden paddle, timing the ferment by the tide instead of a clock. He agreed to write it down and sign it, his hand shaking over the page, because he said nobody had ever asked him what he actually saw. Nadia drove back to the fish camp with the signed statement on the seat beside her, the technician from 1958 alive after all, and willing to speak before Friday. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation hearing was held in the Kodiak Community Hall on Friday morning, folding chairs filled with cannery workers, deckhands, and half the town. A state scientist named Carol Bergstrom set 2 glass jars on the table, one drawn from the old cannery dump site, one from Nadia's fermentation tanks, and read the numbers aloud. The dump site showed fecal coliform counts high enough to close a beach, and ammonia levels that killed eelgrass on contact. The fermentation tank showed a stable, low pH and nitrogen locked into a form plants could actually use. Pyotr Chukwa sat near the back, arms crossed, no longer smiling the way he had outside the store, watching the numbers instead of the woman reading them. Franklin Dolan sat at the front table in a canvas jacket, jaw tight, the harbor he'd used as a drain for 30 years, now measured against a woman's barrels behind a smokehouse. When it was her turn, Nadia laid her grandmother's logbook on the table, open to the water-stained page with 2 names penciled side by side. Simeon Kompkov stood next, cane in hand, and told the room what he'd told her in the cabin, that Franklin Dolan had tested a fermented fish fertilizer in 1958 and gotten results better than anything the cannery was dumping. Franklin Dolan didn't answer right away. He looked at the logbook, then at the old man, then down at his own hands on the table. He said he'd buried the report because crediting an Alutiiq woman's method would have cost him standing with the men who financed the cannery, and admitting that now cost him something too. The state gave the cannery its findings in writing that afternoon: install a fermentation-based treatment system modeled on Nadia's process, or lose its discharge permit by the following season. By August, the harbor water that used to turn rust-colored every summer ran clear past the cannery dock for the first time anyone in town could remember. That fall, A garden supply cooperative out of Anchorage placed an order for $18,000 in liquid fertilizer, more barrels than the smokehouse yard could hold at once. Nadia hired 3 women from town to run the tanks and bottling line, women whose mothers had known her grandmother, and paid them from the first real season of profit. Vera Ivanov never saw any of it, not the hearing, not the contract, not her name finally read aloud in a room full of people who used to laugh at her paddle and her barrels. South of here, in a Louisiana mill town, another woman would find her own answer sealed in an envelope her grandmother told her never to open, and the instructions written on the outside of it would decide whether her sugarcane fiber business survived the season.